David Blackwell stood at the heart of the lavish gala, his perfectly tailored suit gleaming under the bright chandeliers. He was surrounded by influential figures, their laughter and conversation filling the room with a sense of superiority. As he adjusted his cufflinks, his eyes were drawn to a young figure entering the event. Eli, a 16-year-old boy from the slums, stood out starkly amidst the crowd of elite guests. With a mixture of curiosity and disdain, David watched as the boy walked in, his posture confident despite his humble background. When Eli approached, David couldn't help but overhear him conversing fluently in Spanish with one of the guests. The smoothness of his speech caught David's attention. He then shifted to French, effortlessly switching languages, and continued in Arabic, impressing several others around him. David, irritated by the boy's ease, laughed under his breath. "What's this? A street kid showing off?" he muttered to himself. He had no idea that Eli's ability to speak multiple languages was far from a mere party trick. Eli noticed David's skeptical gaze but remained unfazed. His face, though young, held an air of mystery. His eyes didn't give anything away, hiding the depths of a story that no one had asked about. His body language was calm, almost too calm for someone in his situation. He wasn't here to entertain the rich or seek their approval. He was here for something much more important, something that even David would come to realize much later. David approached Eli, his expression one of mockery. "Impressive," he said with a smirk. "But how many languages do you really know? 10? 12? Or is it all just for show?" Eli's gaze never wavered as he met David's eyes. There was a silence between them, one filled with tension that David didn't fully understand. Eli didn't respond with words. Instead, he offered a small, knowing smile, as if the millionaire's taunts were beneath him. David, taken aback by the lack of response, felt a hint of annoyance rise within him. As the night continued, David found himself watching Eli from a distance. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the boy than met the eye. Who was he really? David's mind raced with questions, but he didn't dare ask directly. Eli seemed too elusive, too focused on something else. Despite his own wealth and status, David couldn't help but feel a strange sense of inferiority around the boy's calm confidence and mysterious air. It was clear that Eli wasn't the typical teenager. He carried himself with a maturity that didn't belong to someone from the slums. His effortless control over languages, his poised demeanor, and the way he carried the weight of his own thoughts. All of it left David intrigued but frustrated. This wasn't the behavior of someone trying to fit into the world of the rich. It was as if Eli was observing them from a distance, waiting for something to unfold. What did Eli really want from this encounter? As the event wore on, David found himself questioning his initial judgment. The more he saw Eli interact with people, the more he realized there was something deeper behind those calm eyes. Eli didn't need to flaunt his knowledge. It was clear that he had been to places David couldn't even imagine, places where language was the only thing that kept people alive, where survival depended on adaptability and communication. But David still couldn't grasp how this kid had learned all of it. The night ended without further confrontation, but David couldn't shake the memory of Eli's enigmatic smile. What was the true story behind this young boy? And how had he come to know so much more than David could ever understand? David was no stranger to success, but something about Eli's quiet defiance made him feel as if he had just encountered someone whose life held lessons far beyond his own experience. David couldn't stop thinking about Eli. The young boy from the slums had an undeniable air of mystery, and for the first time in years, David found himself curious about someone who wasn't impressed by his wealth or status. He began watching Eli more closely at the gala, observing how the boy interacted with others. Eli's calm demeanor and the ease with which he navigated different languages caught the attention of several influential figures, but he never seemed eager to please them. There was something about him that hinted at a far deeper story, one that David couldn't ignore. One evening, as they stood in the corner of the venue, David approached Eli with a more genuine interest. "You're not like the others, are you?" he said, his voice carrying a mix of curiosity and arrogance. Eli turned to him, his face impassive as ever, but his eyes held a flicker of something, perhaps amusement. "I'm not trying to be," Eli replied quietly. David couldn't tell if that was a subtle insult or just an observation. There was no bragging or boasting in Eli's voice, just a simple statement of truth. It made David uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite understand. As they stood there, the conversation turned to Eli's life. Eli spoke softly, but with a sense of pride when he described his upbringing in the slums. "Growing up, the streets were my school," he said. "Language was the way I survived. It wasn't about learning to impress. It was about connecting with people, negotiating with anyone who could offer something to eat or a way out." David listened intently, his usual arrogance slipping as Eli spoke. He had heard similar stories before, but never with such depth. Eli's words painted a picture of struggle and resilience, two qualities David had never had to confront in his own life. Eli went on, his voice steady. "I learned from anyone who would teach me, immigrants, travelers, even old books I found in abandoned places. I wasn't concerned with status, I just needed to understand the world beyond my neighborhood. That's what saved me." David was taken aback. There was no self-pity in Eli's words, no bitterness, only a quiet acknowledgement of the harsh realities he'd faced. Eli wasn't looking for sympathy. He had used language as a weapon, a way to build bridges where none existed, and David realized he was learning something valuable in this unexpected conversation. Despite his intrigue, David couldn't fully grasp Eli's calm nature. The boy was 16, but his presence felt much older, much wiser. David was used to people vying for his attention, trying to impress him with their wealth or connections. Eli, however, didn't seem interested in impressing anyone. Instead, he seemed to observe the world around him with an intensity that David couldn't quite place. "I don't need to impress anyone," Eli said, almost as if reading David's mind. "I just need to be understood." Those words hit David harder than he expected. It wasn't about showing off or proving anything. It was about survival. And in Eli's case, survival meant learning to communicate in ways David had never needed to. The conversation took a turn when Eli offered to teach David a few words in Mandarin, a language David had always found daunting. "It's simple," Eli said, his smile faint but sincere. "Just a few words can open up a whole new world." David, taken aback by the offer, chuckled dismissively. "I'm not interested in learning languages," he replied, his tone a mix of arrogance and disbelief. "I have everything I need right here." Eli didn't press the matter, simply nodding as though he expected that response, but something in his eyes made David pause. He had rejected Eli's offer without thinking, but now he felt a pang of doubt. Perhaps he had missed something important, something Eli had tried to show him. Over the next few days, David kept his distance, but couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. Eli's words about survival and connection echoed in his mind, challenging the assumptions David had about life. Despite his wealth, David had never experienced anything like what Eli had described. He had never had to fight for survival, never had to learn another language just to make it through the day. Eli's calm confidence and quiet strength had unsettled David in a way that no one had in years. What was it about this young boy that made him so different? Why was Eli so quiet about his past, hiding pieces of himself from even those closest to him? David found himself increasingly drawn to Eli, not just as a curiosity, but as someone who seemed to hold the keys to a world David had never even considered. Yet, there was a part of Eli's past that remained locked away. Eli spoke of his life in the slums, but never mentioned how he got there or what exactly drove him to become the person he was now. Why was he so careful with his words? Why did he choose to reveal only fragments of his story, as if he were guarding something far more important? David couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Eli's silence than mere modesty. What was he really hiding, and what had Eli experienced that had shaped him into the person standing before David? David couldn't shake the feeling that Eli was somehow toying with him. The boy was too calm, too composed for someone who came from such humble beginnings. David, growing increasingly frustrated with Eli's lack of reaction to his earlier comments, felt a need to prove his superiority. "You speak all these languages, but what's the point?" he scoffed, leaning back in his chair, studying Eli. "Are you just trying to impress people, or do you have real aspirations?" Eli didn't flinch at the jab. He simply looked at David with that same inscrutable expression, his eyes betraying nothing. David, irritated by the boy's indifference, decided it was time to issue a challenge. "You claim to know all these languages, but can you speak Zulu?" David asked, his tone laced with mockery. "I bet you can't even say a word in it. If you can speak it fluently, I'll give you a large sum of money. How's that for an incentive?" The room grew quiet as the words hung in the air. David's challenge was meant to be a joke, a way to show Eli that no matter how many languages he knew, he was still just a kid from the slums. But instead of backing down, Eli's eyes narrowed slightly, and his lips curled into a faint smile. Without hesitation, Eli responded, "I accept." His voice was calm, but the confidence in his tone sent a chill down David's spine. There was no hesitation, no fear, just a quiet assurance that made David question his initial judgment. Eli wasn't intimidated. He wasn't trying to prove himself either. He simply saw the challenge for what it was, a test of skill, and he was ready to face it. David's smirk faltered as he watched Eli stand up with an air of quiet determination. It was as if Eli had already decided that the challenge didn't matter. The money, irrelevant. The reward, secondary. David, now taken aback by Eli's unwavering confidence, found himself growing curious. "How can you be so sure you can speak Zulu?" he asked, his tone more guarded than before. "Do you think that because you've learned all these other languages, Zulu will be easy for you?" Eli glanced at him, his smile never fading. "It's not about easy or hard," he said simply. "It's about understanding the people, their culture, and the context behind their language. Zulu isn't just a language, it's a gateway." David wasn't sure if he understood, but he was intrigued. There was more to Eli than just linguistic talent. There was a depth of knowledge and insight that David couldn't yet comprehend. As the challenge began, Eli effortlessly switched between different languages, warming up before tackling Zulu. The ease with which he moved from one language to another was nothing short of mesmerizing. David watched in silence, unable to shake the feeling that he had underestimated this boy in ways he hadn't even realized. The boy wasn't just fluent in several languages, he was a master of them, each one a tool in his arsenal, each one tied to his survival and understanding of the world. David's mind raced with questions. How did Eli manage to learn so many languages? What kind of life had he led to acquire such skills? Eli's ability to absorb and speak languages was far beyond anything David had imagined. The boy spoke Zulu with ease, his pronunciation flawless, his sentence structure perfect. It was clear that Eli didn't just know the words, he understood the culture behind them. As he continued, David began to feel a growing sense of discomfort. This wasn't just a party trick or some idle boast. Eli had lived a life that had forced him to learn, to adapt, to survive. And as much as David hated to admit it, he was beginning to realize that Eli was a far more formidable person than he had ever expected. David's dismissive attitude faltered with every word Eli spoke. The Zulu language flowed effortlessly from Eli's lips, his eyes never leaving David's. It wasn't just fluency that Eli demonstrated. It was understanding, a deep connection to the words he spoke. There was no hesitation in Eli's speech, no self-consciousness, just a quiet power in his command of the language. David's own arrogance, once so firmly rooted in his wealth and social status, began to feel insignificant in the face of Eli's quiet resilience and mastery of skills that David could never dream of acquiring. When Eli finished speaking, he stood there silently, waiting for David's reaction. The room remained eerily quiet, the weight of the moment settling in. David, still processing what he had just witnessed, realized that the challenge had been about more than just languages. It had been a test of character, of resilience, and Eli had passed with flying colors. As David stood there, still trying to come to terms with what had just happened, Eli gave him a brief nod, as if to acknowledge that the challenge had never been about money or recognition. It was about proving something deeper, something that David couldn't yet understand. As the night continued, the room felt different to David. There was an underlying tension, a growing sense of unease that he couldn't shake. He watched Eli, who stood quietly, his expression impassive. It wasn't just the ease with which Eli spoke different languages that intrigued David now. It was the quiet confidence in the boy's demeanor. David had always prided himself on his intellect, his ability to navigate the world with wealth and influence. But here was a 16-year-old boy, from the slums no less, who possessed something David could never buy: knowledge, adaptability, and a deep understanding of people. This thought gnawed at him as he approached Eli, hoping to uncover more. "How did you really learn all these languages?" David asked, his voice tinged with a mix of curiosity and defensiveness. Eli didn't answer immediately, as though he were deciding how much to reveal. Then with a slow, deliberate motion, Eli spoke, his voice steady but carrying the weight of unspoken stories. "It wasn't just about learning a language for the sake of learning it," Eli began. "It was about survival. In the slums, communication was everything. If you didn't understand people, you didn't last long." Eli's words were simple, but David felt an unspoken depth behind them, one that went beyond academic knowledge or language classes. David listened intently as Eli continued, explaining how he had learned from anyone he could. Immigrants, travelers, old men in cafes, even strangers I met on the streets. Every person had something to offer, something I could learn. But it wasn't just about speaking their words, it was about understanding them. If I could communicate with someone, I could negotiate, survive, and even find allies where others saw only enemies. The way Eli spoke of learning languages felt like a form of armor, a way to protect himself in a world that had given him nothing. David felt a flicker of discomfort. This wasn't the type of knowledge he was used to. This was something primal, tied directly to survival. Eli paused for a moment as though reflecting on his words. "I found books too, old, discarded books, ones people forgot about. I picked them up from the streets, from market stalls, wherever I could find them. They became my windows to the world." His voice softened as he spoke of the books, and David noticed the shift in Eli's demeanor. There was a reverence in his tone, a respect for the knowledge he had found. "I didn't have teachers," Eli said, almost to himself. "I had to teach myself. Every word I learned was a lifeline, a bridge to something better, something beyond the struggle." David couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He'd grown up with the best schools, the best tutors, and all the resources money could buy. Yet here was Eli, a boy who had grown up in a world of scarcity, using what little he had to gain a knowledge that David could never fully grasp. He realized that Eli wasn't just educated in a conventional sense. He had learned to speak, to listen, and to understand in ways that David never had to. The arrogance that had been so natural to him started to feel misplaced, as though it were a barrier to understanding the true depth of knowledge. "The languages I learned," Eli continued, "weren't just tools to communicate. They were the way I understood the world, the way I understood people's pain, their struggles, and their dreams. In the slums, people didn't always speak the same language, but they understood each other on a different level. Language for me became a way to connect, to survive, and to fight for something more." David stood there in silence, grappling with the magnitude of Eli's words. This wasn't just about intelligence. It was about resilience, about the will to survive and adapt when the world was stacked against you. David suddenly felt small in Eli's presence, something he wasn't accustomed to. He had always seen himself as a man who could command respect, who had earned his place at the top through hard work and intellect. But Eli's story wasn't about wealth or privilege. It was about necessity, about overcoming every obstacle with the power of language. "I didn't just learn languages," Eli said, his eyes locking onto David's. "I learned to understand people, and in the slums, understanding someone is more valuable than money." The weight of that statement hung in the air, and for the first time, David felt a sharp pang of realization. Eli had mastered something he could never buy or control: true empathy. As Eli finished speaking, the room felt suddenly quieter, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the truth of his words. David was left with a strange mix of admiration and discomfort. Eli's linguistic skills weren't just about knowledge. They were about survival, resilience, and the ability to connect with people on a level that David had never experienced. For the first time in his life, David questioned whether his wealth, his success, and his education had made him wiser, or had they only made him more distant from the world that Eli had fought so hard to understand. Eli stood across from David, his expression calm as he prepared to teach him a few words in Zulu. "Let's start with something simple," Eli said, his voice steady and confident. David, still unsure of what to expect, nodded and braced himself. He had always prided himself on his intellect, and the idea of learning a new language from a 16-year-old boy seemed like a challenge he could easily overcome. But as Eli began to pronounce the Zulu words with perfect precision, David felt a growing sense of frustration. The sounds were foreign, difficult, and nothing like the languages he was used to hearing in his high society circles. "How can anyone even understand this?" David muttered, his patience beginning to wear thin. "It's like a tongue twister." He struggled to mimic the sounds, his frustration mounting with each failed attempt. Eli watched him with an unreadable expression, offering no judgment. "It's all in the way you listen," Eli said quietly. "You have to hear the rhythm of the language, not just the words." David's brow furrowed in confusion. How could he hear something that felt so out of reach? "I can't get it," he muttered, shaking his head in frustration. "This is impossible." Eli didn't respond with impatience or annoyance. Instead, he offered a small, understanding smile. "You don't need to get it all at once," Eli said, his tone soft yet firm. "You just need to want to understand it." David paused, momentarily thrown off by Eli's calm demeanor. He had expected a boast, some form of superiority from the boy, but there was none. Eli's patience was unwavering, his demeanor almost serene. "You might have money, David," Eli continued, his gaze meeting David's, "but you don't have one thing I have, the desire to learn." The words hit David harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to respond, but couldn't find the words. What did Eli mean by that? Was it possible that the very thing he took for granted, the wealth, the status, had somehow dulled his own desire to truly learn? David stood there, caught in a moment of reflection. For the first time, he felt a deep sense of uncertainty about himself. He had always believed that his success was a direct result of his intelligence and drive, but Eli's words made him question that. Was his drive truly about knowledge, or was it just about winning, about gaining more wealth and power? In all his years of business and social climbing, he had never truly learned for the sake of learning. He had always been looking for the next advantage, the next step up. Eli, on the other hand, had learned for survival, for understanding, for connection. David's gaze shifted to the boy standing before him, teaching him words in a language he could barely understand. Eli didn't care about rewards or accolades. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. The challenge wasn't about showing off or proving something. It was about something deeper, something David hadn't been able to grasp. Eli's knowledge of languages wasn't born from wealth or privilege. It was born from necessity. It was something David had never experienced, and yet it was something he now found himself envying. "How do you do it?" David finally asked, his voice quieter than before. "How do you keep learning no matter what?" Eli smiled slightly, his eyes thoughtful as he looked at David. "I didn't have a choice," he said simply. "When you grow up in a place where survival depends on your ability to communicate, you learn fast. You learn because you have to. It's not a luxury, it's a necessity." David absorbed the words, the weight of them sinking in. He had never experienced that level of urgency in his life. For him, learning had always been a choice, something to be pursued for status or self-improvement. But for Eli, it was a matter of life and death. There was no room for arrogance or complacency when survival was at stake. For the first time, David realized that his approach to learning had been fundamentally different from Eli's. While he had approached knowledge as a means to enhance his position in the world, Eli had approached it as a way to connect, to survive, and to thrive. There was a purity to Eli's desire to learn, a focus that David had never truly understood until now. David began to feel a strange respect for the boy standing before him. He still couldn't fully grasp Eli's motivation, but he knew there was something profound there, something that went beyond the words they were exchanging. David took a deep breath, trying once again to repeat the Zulu words. He struggled, but this time he didn't give up as quickly. He didn't want to admit it, but Eli's patience was slowly starting to break down the walls of his own arrogance. He had always believed that intelligence was about speed, about getting to the answer before anyone else. But Eli was teaching him something different, something more valuable. It wasn't about getting it right immediately. It was about the process, the willingness to fail and try again, the understanding that learning was a journey, not a race. The question still lingered in David's mind. How did Eli know that he needed to hear this lesson? What was it about David's life, about his own experiences, that Eli had already seen through? The mystery deepened, but David knew one thing for sure. He was no longer the one in control of this challenge. The moment Eli began speaking in Zulu, the room fell into a stunned silence. His fluency was astonishing. Every word, every syllable, precise and confident. David stood frozen, the smug expression he had worn moments before now replaced with something darker, something closer to disbelief. Eli didn't just speak Zulu, he brought it to life, his voice flowing effortlessly, as though he had been raised with it as his first language. And then, to the shock of everyone, Eli switched languages. Spanish, French, Arabic, Mandarin. Each transition was seamless, each language spoken with the same effortless grace. By the time he finished, he had spoken 10 different languages, each one more intricate than the last. David's mind raced, trying to catch up with what was happening. He had thought of this challenge as a simple test, a way to put Eli in his place. Instead, Eli had turned it into a performance, showcasing a depth of skill David couldn't comprehend. The room was still silent, the air thick with astonishment. Eli stood there, calm and composed, his eyes never leaving David's. The boy had just shattered David's preconceptions, and for the first time in years, David felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: humility. He couldn't deny it anymore. Eli was not just a prodigy, he was something far more complex. As the final word left Eli's lips, the room erupted into murmurs. The guests, initially dismissive, now looked at him with awe and admiration. David, still in a state of shock, struggled to form words. How did you learn all of this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eli didn't immediately respond, his gaze steady. It was as if the question didn't surprise him, as if he had expected it all along. He took a moment before speaking, his voice low and measured. "I didn't learn these languages because I wanted to impress anyone. I learned them because I had to." The room grew even quieter as they waited for him to continue, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. David leaned in, sensing that Eli was about to reveal something important. "Survival, David," Eli said, his eyes locked onto David's. "When you grow up in a place where survival depends on your ability to connect with others, you learn quickly. Language is not just a skill, it's a tool. It's how you survive." The weight of his words hit David like a punch to the stomach. Eli wasn't speaking about language as an intellectual pursuit. For him, it was a matter of life and death. The ease with which Eli had switched between languages wasn't the result of privilege or access to resources. It was the result of necessity. David could feel a shiver run down his spine as the reality of Eli's life began to sink in. Eli's voice softened, and for the first time, there was a vulnerability in it. When I was younger, I didn't have the luxury of being sheltered. I didn't grow up in a place where people spoke the same language or even the same dialect. I learned because I had to communicate with people who didn't want to talk to me, or worse, people who wanted to use me. The words were raw, and the room fell into a heavy silence. Eli wasn't just a boy with a gift for languages. He was a survivor of a world that had forced him to adapt, to speak, to negotiate, or else face the consequences. The mystery of how he had learned all those languages now had a darker answer. He had learned them not for knowledge, but for survival. David's thoughts raced. He had always seen language as a tool to climb the social ladder, a way to make connections that could benefit him. But Eli's relationship with language was completely different. For Eli, language wasn't about advancing his position. It was about staying alive. David had never had to struggle in that way. He had never been in a position where his life depended on how well he could communicate, on whether or not he could understand and empathize with people who didn't want anything to do with him. This revelation hit David harder than any business failure ever could. As Eli continued, his gaze softened, and he seemed to be speaking more to himself than to anyone else. I had to learn languages to survive dark events. Things that I don't talk about, things that are better left in the past. But without them, I wouldn't be here today. David wanted to press further, to understand the full scope of what Eli had endured, but something in Eli's demeanor stopped him. The boy wasn't ready to share the full story, and David could sense that. There was a limit to how much Eli was willing to reveal, and that only deepened the mystery of his past. What exactly had Eli gone through to make him so resilient? What had forced him to become the person standing before David now? The silence that followed Eli's words was suffocating. David stood motionless, trying to process the weight of what had been said. For the first time, he saw Eli not as a puzzle to be solved or a challenge to be defeated, but as a human being, someone who had survived unimaginable circumstances. The question David had asked, how had Eli learned these languages so quickly, now seemed insignificant. The real question was, what had Eli survived? And in that moment, David realized that he would never fully understand Eli's journey, not unless he was willing to look beyond his own narrow view of the world. The boy before him had learned more than languages. He had learned how to navigate a world that was unforgiving, and it had shaped him in ways David could never imagine. David stood there, his mind reeling from the revelation Eli had just shared. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a profound sense of awe and disbelief. For the first time, David realized that he had underestimated the young boy in front of him in every possible way. Eli wasn't just a linguistic prodigy, he was a survivor, someone who had faced unimaginable challenges and emerged stronger. David, feeling a mix of guilt and respect, took a step toward Eli, his voice trembling slightly. I don't know what to say, he began, his usual arrogance replaced by something softer. I was wrong about you. I apologize. Eli's expression didn't change, but there was a faint flicker of understanding in his eyes. David could tell that the apology meant little to Eli. It wasn't about being right or wrong, it was about something much deeper, something that David hadn't yet grasped. Eli's gaze remained steady as David continued, his words coming faster now. You've proven yourself in ways I can't even comprehend. You deserve more than a reward for this, and I want to make it right. I'll give you whatever you want, a large sum of money, anything. David's offer was genuine, but Eli didn't seem to react the way David expected. Instead of looking pleased or even considering the offer, Eli simply shook his head. I don't want your money, he said softly. David blinked, taken aback by the response. You don't want it, he repeated, his voice almost incredulous. You've just shown the world you can do things that most people can't. You deserve it. You could have anything you want, Eli. But Eli remained unmoved. His expression was calm, almost detached as he responded. "Money doesn't change anything for me. It's just a distraction." David's mind churned as he tried to understand Eli's response. It was a foreign concept to him. How could someone refuse an opportunity to enrich themselves? Money, success, power, these were the things that had defined David's life. They were his tools, his means of survival, and his way of commanding respect. But Eli, despite his undeniable talent and potential, didn't seem interested in any of that. His refusal made David question everything he had believed about success. "Then what do you want?" David asked, his voice more urgent now, as if searching for a deeper meaning. Eli's gaze softened, and for the first time he seemed to lower his guard slightly. "I don't need your money," he said, his voice steady but firm. "What I want is to help others like me, people who don't have a chance because they don't speak the right language or come from the right place. My purpose isn't to be rich or famous. My purpose is to make sure others can survive too." David's heart skipped a beat as the weight of Eli's words settled on him. There was no hint of greed in Eli's voice, no desire for luxury or status. His motivations were entirely different, and David realized that his understanding of success had been skewed all along. Eli paused for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to share more. Then, in a quieter voice, he spoke again. "When I was growing up, I didn't have anything but my words. My ability to communicate, to understand people, that was the one thing that kept me alive. Language was my currency. It was how I made deals, how I survived the streets, and how I built relationships with people who could help me. I learned early on that money and status don't matter if you can't connect with the world around you." The depth of Eli's insight struck David like a wave. For the first time, he began to see that true power wasn't in wealth or social standing. It was in the ability to understand and connect. David stood in silence for a long moment, absorbing everything Eli had said. His mind raced as he thought about his own life, his own struggles, and the ways he had tried to build his empire. He had always believed that money was the key to everything, that it could open doors, solve problems, and give him power over others. But now, looking at Eli, he understood that there were things money couldn't buy. Empathy, resilience, and wisdom. These were things that came from life experience, from struggle, from the kind of hardship that David had never truly known. For the first time, David felt small in comparison. Eli wasn't interested in wealth because he had already learned the most important lesson of all, that the things that matter in life can't be bought. And as David stood there, humbled by the realization, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the lesson Eli had unknowingly given him. The young boy from the slums, with his quiet strength and wisdom, had shown David that true success wasn't about how much you had, but about how well you could connect with others, how deeply you could understand them. And that, David now understood, was a currency far more valuable than money could ever be. Eli stood in front of David, his gaze unwavering, as the weight of his words began to settle in. The room, once filled with excitement and disbelief, had fallen silent, as if anticipating the truth Eli was finally ready to share. David had long known that there was something deeper behind Eli's talents, something that went beyond languages and survival. But now, as Eli spoke, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "I never wanted fame or money, David," Eli said, his voice steady and resolute. "What I want is something much more important than that." David leaned in, his curiosity piqued. "Then what is it? What is your true purpose?" Eli paused, his eyes reflecting a deep sadness, a lifetime of untold stories. "My purpose is to help people like me, kids who are stuck in the same cycle of poverty I grew up in. They don't have the opportunities to learn or the means to escape. And the one thing I have is knowledge that can set them free." David's heart skipped a beat as he realized the depth of Eli's mission. This wasn't about self-glorification or personal gain. It was about something much bigger than both of them. Eli wasn't just teaching languages to pass the time. He was creating a lifeline for those who had none. Eli's eyes softened as he spoke of the young people he had met in his life, kids who had no idea that learning could be the key to their future. Language is a tool, David. It's a way out of the streets, a way to connect with people who can help. But it's also a way to break the cycle, to show kids that there's something more than what they see around them. The room, once filled with a sense of disbelief, now felt charged with a quiet intensity. David, stunned by the revelation, began to grasp the enormity of Eli's mission. It wasn't just about teaching, it was about changing lives, one lesson at a time. For the first time, David understood why Eli had been so elusive about his intentions. He hadn't been hiding out of pride or arrogance, he had been protecting something precious, his purpose. Eli wasn't here to impress or to prove anything. He had been focused on something greater than himself, something that required quiet dedication and an unyielding belief in the power of education. The mystery that had surrounded Eli's motivations now made perfect sense. He had always known that language was his weapon, his bridge to a better future, not for himself, but for others. As a kid, I didn't have much, Eli continued, his voice tinged with sorrow. But I had words. I had the ability to speak to people who had the power to change my life. I used that to survive, to escape. And now I want to give that gift to others. The weight of his past was clear in every syllable he spoke. Eli's linguistic abilities weren't just a product of intellect. They were a product of pain, of survival, of desperation. It was that pain that had driven him to learn, to master the languages that had been his lifeline. And now he was passing that knowledge on, hoping that it would be the key to someone else's freedom. David listened intently, feeling a growing sense of admiration for Eli. He had always believed that success was measured by wealth and status, but Eli had shown him that the truest form of success was the ability to give, to impact others' lives in a meaningful way. Eli's mission wasn't about creating wealth, it was about creating change. And that change, as David now realized, wasn't just for a few select people. It was for anyone who had been left behind, for anyone who had been told that they didn't matter. Eli's true goal was to ensure that no one would ever feel that way again. As Eli spoke, David began to see the world through a different lens. His own life, filled with luxury and privilege, had been so different from Eli's, yet the boy before him had managed to do something David had never even considered. He had made his pain into purpose. The language that had once been Eli's escape had now become his way of reaching back, of lifting others up and showing them a path out of the darkness. David's eyes opened to the realization that the true power in the world wasn't in wealth, but in the ability to inspire and empower others. When Eli finished speaking, there was a heavy silence in the room, as if the truth had shifted the very atmosphere. David stood there, humbled and profoundly moved by what he had just learned. Eli had never sought recognition or reward. His satisfaction came from knowing that he was helping others break free from the same chains he had once fought to escape. For the first time in his life, David understood what it meant to have a true purpose. One that wasn't driven by selfish desire or external validation, but by the desire to make the world a better place for others. The mystery of Eli's mission had been revealed, and David knew that he would never see the world or himself in the same way again. As the video neared its end, the room that had once been filled with tension and disbelief now seemed to hum with a new energy. David, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the lights, turned to Eli with a sense of profound respect. The challenge he had once seen as a simple test had turned into something much deeper. It was no longer about who knew more languages or who had more money. It was about something far more powerful. David had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or status, but in the ability to give others the tools to change their lives. He looked at Eli and with a firm resolve made a decision that would change the course of his own life. "I want to help," David said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "I want to make sure that what you're doing here, what you've built, grows. I want to be part of it." Eli's eyes softened as he listened, a quiet smile tugging at the corner of his lips. David's transformation was palpable, the arrogant, wealth-driven man who had once mocked Eli, now a believer in something greater. "I'll invest," David continued. "I'll help fund your foundation, help you reach even more young people who need this chance." The words felt heavy with meaning, as if David were marking the beginning of a new chapter in his life, a chapter that would no longer be defined by wealth but by purpose. Eli didn't respond immediately, his expression thoughtful. "I appreciate your offer, David," he said quietly, "but this isn't about money. It's about making sure these kids have the opportunity to learn, to grow, to survive." His words echoed with the same conviction David had heard earlier, but now there was a deeper layer of understanding between them. Eli had never been about accumulating wealth or power. His focus had always been on the future he could help build for others. The investment David offered wasn't just financial, it was a symbolic gesture, a way for David to align himself with a mission that was far more important than anything he had ever pursued. David nodded slowly, understanding what Eli meant. His investment wasn't just going to be about dollars, it was about being part of a legacy, about joining forces with Eli to create a world where young people from the slums no longer had to struggle to survive. He wasn't just helping to fund a project, he was helping to build a future. "I get it now," David said, his voice quieter. "This is bigger than all of us. It's about creating a lasting impact." Eli met his gaze, and for the first time, David saw the full extent of the young boy's vision. It wasn't just about languages. It was about teaching resilience, empowering others to break free from the cycles of poverty, and showing them that they, too, could have a voice in a world that had long ignored them. As the video came to a close, the camera panned over images of Eli's foundation, showing the faces of young people engaged in language lessons, working together, learning not just words, but also the resilience that had shaped Eli's life. David's heart swelled with pride as he watched. This wasn't just a charitable endeavor, it was a movement. Eli was no longer just a boy from the slums. He was a force of change, a beacon of hope for hundreds of young people who had been written off by society. And now, thanks to the partnership between Eli and David, that force would only grow stronger. The legacy they were building was not about the wealth they could accumulate, but about the impact they could make on the world. But even as Eli's work began to take shape and grow, there was a lingering mystery that David couldn't shake. What else did Eli hide about his past? The boy had shared so much, his struggles, his journey, his passion for helping others. But there were still shadows in his story, things he hadn't yet revealed. David knew there was more to Eli's journey than met the eye. Perhaps one day, Eli would open up about the full extent of the darkness he had survived. But for now, David respected the boy's silence, understanding that some things were better left unsaid, buried deep where they wouldn't hinder the future Eli was building. As the months passed, the foundation grew, expanding its reach and helping more young people than ever before. Eli continued to teach not just languages, but life lessons, lessons that had been forged in the fires of his difficult past. The program provided hope, a chance for these kids to learn, to dream, and to believe that they too could change their lives. And for every success story that emerged, David couldn't help but reflect on his own transformation. He had once believed that money and status were the keys to everything, but now he understood that the real key was something far more elusive, the ability to inspire others, to empower them, and to give them the tools they needed to change their own futures. As the legacy of Eli's work spread, more people came to understand the true power of knowledge. David had seen it firsthand, the way Eli had turned his pain into purpose, his words into weapons of hope. It was a reminder to everyone involved that at the heart of every great change, there is always a story of resilience, of people who refuse to give up no matter the odds. And in the end, Eli's true legacy would not be in the languages he spoke, or even in the money he helped raise. It would be in the countless lives he had touched, the countless young people who had been given the opportunity to break free from the chains of poverty and create their own futures.